Hi, this is Raphael Mudge, the creator of Cobalt Strike. This is a course on in-memory evasion. Yes, I said course. I tried to put this content into a blog post. It was way too long. I tried to take what I thought I had to say and put it into a single presentation. It's too much. So instead, we have a 4-part course. Part 1 of this course discusses the properties of processes, threads, and memory, and the anomalies in those things that are used to detect memory-injected DLLs. Part 2 of this course is a deep dive into the Cobalt Strike beacon payload and how it interacts with these memory detections for various common actions you might take. Part 3 of this course covers evasion. Evasion is not a bit that you flip in a malleable C2 profile and call it good. No. Evasion, in light of these types of detections, is a multi-pronged strategy. First, you must analyze your actions for various OPSEC considerations before you take them. You must also know what your tools are capable of and configure them in a way that is optimal for the circumstance. And as an operator, you need to know which actions are safe, which are not, and adjust your operations accordingly. And we're going to talk about all 3 of those items in part 3 of this course. Finally, I'm a big believer that red teaming is not just hiding in a network for months trying to avoid getting caught, but red teaming is also training analysts and dialing up the sophistication and dialing it back and supporting various kinds of storylines. And we're going to talk about how to do that in memory when we discuss thread emulation in part 4. So that's going to be a lot of fun too. I have 3 goals for this particular course. The first goal is to impart an understanding of how some blue teams detect payloads in memory today. I would also like to walk you through your options to challenge and defeat these detections. Finally, the most important part of this course, the longest lasting benefit of it, in my opinion, is I want to take you through how to evaluate your offense playbook against the detections presented here. But this mindset doesn't apply just to these detections. As new detections become known, I hope you will feel empowered after this course to evaluate your actions against those detections and adjust your operations accordingly. All right, let's jump into part 1, memory detections. In this lecture, we'll start out with a definition of memory detections. We'll then walk through the properties of processes, threads, and memory, and the anomalies of those properties that are used to detect memory-injected DLLs. In memory detection applications, we'll cover where these types of heuristics are used, and we'll wrap this lecture up with a discussion of various detection tools. Let's define memory detections. I define memory detections as the use of process, memory, and thread indicators to detect malicious payloads. Now you may be asking, Raphael, what do you mean? Malicious payloads? Is security solved? Is this the silver bullet marketing has long promised that they have? Is it done? Can we go home? No, not really. This is not a silver bullet technology to detect all malicious activity. the techniques we're going to cover are very good at detecting memory-injected DLLs. I'd like to start with saying that detecting memory-injected DLLs is fair game. Many well-known and effective offense tool sets do use memory-injected DLLs. Cobalt Strike, Metasploit, Empire. Tool sets believed to be developed and used by nation-state actors. Criminal malware. Many of these things do use memory-injected DLLs. But it is possible to perform offense actions without memory-injected DLLs. For example, a remote desktop client can be just as effective for offense actions as an offense tool set. The other thing is the presence of these techniques don't necessarily mean intent, okay? Software other than offensive tool sets do use memory-injected DLLs. For example, video game cheats, debugging tools, some kinds of spyware. Okay, I'm not selling it very well, am I? These techniques do show up. Another place they show up, security products. Yes, security products will often inject DLLs into remote processes to give themselves visibility that might be difficult to get otherwise. And one of the struggles that security product vendors go through is trying to figure out how to deconflict their detection heuristics so that they don't flag other security products that might be present on the same system. It is a very, very real problem. And as we go through this presentation and these detections, please don't forget that. All right, let's talk process, thread, and memory properties. Throughout this course, we're going to use a tool called Process Hacker to analyze the process, thread, and memory properties of our processes and to see the anomalies used for detection firsthand. Process Hacker describes itself as a free, powerful, multi-purpose tool that helps you monitor system resources, debug software, and detect malware. It's available at processhacker.sourceforge.net. All right, let's do a quick demonstration of Process Hacker. Here I am on a Windows 7 system. We're going to go into my nifty response folder. And I'm going to run Process Hacker as administrator. Let's go ahead and allow that to run. And here it is. And let's go ahead and pick a process to look into. So we're just going to go ahead and double click on Explore. And here are some property processes, some thread properties. We can see the threads running in the program. And we can see the memory. We can sort by the memory permissions, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So all kinds of different things here, okay? And if we want, we can also look at the strings located in memory as well. So Process Hacker gives us access to that information too. We just press the strings button to do that. So that's kind of a quick look at Process Hacker. The main thing I again want you to take away is Process Hacker lets us look at the properties of a process, of its threads, and its memory. All right, now that we're acquainted with Process Hacker, let's jump into some of the observable properties and the meaning they might have to us. Here are some of the observable process properties. You have the parent process, the process name, whether or not it's signed and whether or not that signature is valid, the command line arguments, current working directory, and of course, other properties. The main thing I want to point out is that these properties are all fair game to identify malicious from not malicious, and even identify circumstances where a tool set might say that's completely legitimate. I'm not even going to look at it because I don't want to risk a false positive. One place where you'll often see that is when a process might be signed by a very high trust entity like Microsoft. In some cases, some programs do get a free pass from security procs to further avoid false positives. So do keep that in mind. What about threads? Threads have a number of properties. The thread ID, the start address of the function the thread was kicked off with, and if that start address is associated with a DLL or the executable itself, which file that is, and the thread priority. So these are just a few properties of the threads. And you can see that in the Threads tab in Process Hacker as well. What about memory? Well, memory, you have the base address. You have the type of memory. Is it a file on disk mapped to a location in memory? Is it memory we just happen to allocate for regular use? What is the state of that memory? Is it free? Is it reserved? Or is it committed and ready to be used right now? What about the size of the block? How big of a chunk of memory do we have? And another observable, if it is a memory mapped file, which file is it? The memory also has permissions, what the program can do. Can it read to the memory? Can it read from the memory? Can it write to it? Can it execute? So read, write, execute. And there's a few variations of those properties as well that especially apply for memory mapped files. Another one that you don't see in Process Hacker but could be used for anomaly detection is the initial permissions. An analyst happens to have access to both the initial state of the memory, the initial permissions it was allocated with, and the current permissions. So keep that in mind. And here I have from MSDN the memory basic information struct that shows the different properties available to a programmer walking memory with a function like virtual query. So those are some memory properties. Moving along, now that we know some of those properties, let's talk about anomalies used to detect memory injected DLLs. We're going to talk about an anomaly related to the thread start address, memory permissions, and memory content indicators as well. Let's start with the thread start address. One common indicator is to look for a thread that has a start address not associated with a memory mapped file in the current process space. And you may be asking, why? Why does that heuristic work? Well, when a program creates a thread, oftentimes it is going to call a function. And that function is either going to reside in the current program itself, which is a memory mapped file in the current process space, or it's going to call a function in a DLL that happens to exist as a memory mapped file in the current process space. Any threads not associated with a memory mapped file are suspect. And for injected DLLs, life's a little harder because injected DLLs, unless some special care was taken, don't usually exist as memory mapped files. They can. There are ways to do so, but there are certainly ways where you don't exist as a memory mapped file. The point here is any thread that has a start address not associated with a memory mapped file is suspect. What about memory permissions? One heuristic that is very common, very well known, is to look for regions of memory with read, write, execute permissions. You may be asking, why? Well, requesting liberal permissions when allocating memory is a very common pattern in offense tools. Sometimes out of necessity, other times out of a lazy default. When we go through Cobalt Strike's chain to get a payload in memory in the next lecture, we'll talk about that. RWX permissions do occur in normal use, but much, much less common, okay? You might see them in a situation where a virtual machine is involved, but not always, so be aware of that. One thing I want to caution though, RWX permissions are really the tip of the iceberg of what's possible in this game of looking for anomalies in memory permissions. What I really want you to be thinking about are odd pairs of an initial state for memory permissions and current state, because that's what's observable. Some offense tool sets, even Cobalt Strike, have moved to allocating read-write memory, populating that memory with what needs to be there, and then switching it over to read-execute. That pair can be an indicator if it's not a common pair compared to normal activity on a system. So I just want you to think that way. Don't just think get rid of RWX and you're okay. No, the problem is anomalies in these particular pairs. But I'm a practical guy, and I will say if the defensive posture you're working with happens to focus just on RWX and your other allocation pairs are just fine, go to town. But be aware that when RWX stops working, vendors and analysts are going to start focusing on these pairs more, for what that's worth. What about memory content? Well, there's two things you need to worry about here. The first is signs of a DLL or executable of a PE file in memory, not associated with a module on disk. The other thing you need to worry about is strings or patterns associated with the tool set you're using. And you may be asking, okay, that's vague, Rafi. What do you mean here? Well, an executable or DLL, a P file, has a format, and that format happens to have certain identifiable strings and magic bytes, or even information that might cross-correlate and say, yeah, this is a PE file. So, for example, you have at the top there the magic header, the MZ letters, which indicate a PE file. You have a string, this program cannot be run in DOS mode, all kinds of good things. These are things that some analysts and some software solutions do look at when walking through memory to identify a potential memory injected executable or DLL file. So I want to emphasize, these are indicators. These are things that are used to, in general, find memory injected files. What about known strings? Well, here's an example of a set of Yara rules that pick up Cobalt Strike's beacon payload. These Yara rules were written by Florian Roth, and they're available on his GitHub. And they were pulled from a report that was about documented misuse of Cobalt Strike's trial. So be aware, if you're a Cobalt Strike user, which I assume is many of you viewing this presentation, that there are known strings for your tool set. And those known strings can be indicators used to detect or disrupt your activity. Now that we've covered these anomalies in processes, threads, and memory, let's take a look at what this looks like with Process Hacker and Cobalt Strike's beacon payload. Here we are with the Cobalt Strike trial in Kali Linux. I'm using the trial here because the trial happens to have different tells that play favorably to these detection heuristics. And I do that on purpose. So if we go to Attacks, Packages, Windows Executable, we're going to generate a 32-bit executable. And let's go ahead and host it. Attacks, web drive by host file. Let's grab that artifact.exe. We'll save it as demo.exe. Why not? Stick it on the web server. And let's go over to our Windows 7 target. And let's go ahead and grab that executable. And let's hit run to run it. Okay. And if we come down here, we can see Internet Explorer, and its child happens to be demo.exe. All right, good. Come over here to Cobalt Strike. We have a beacon, process 1296. Come over to our target, process 1296. Let's double click on that executable and a few things. First, the executable is not signed, and it's executing from a temporary folder. Okay, so these are all things that could be used as indicators to determine whether or not we are baseline trustworthy or not. Moving along, let's take a look at our threads. And what you can see here is several threads associated with our actual executable or a DLL loaded by our executable. But you can see thread 2212 has 0 by 0 as the start address. This is a thread not associated with a module on disk. So that's an indicator. That's something that will flag. All right, let's go look at memory. So let's come over here to the memory tab. And let's sort by protect, the memory protection for our pages. Scroll down, all these read pages, read write, and you can see here you have a memory map file, and the file, right? And you've got these three blocks, read, write, execute, read, write, execute, read, write, execute, associated with nothing. Okay, the 4 kilobytes here happens to be the Cobalt Strike stager. And let's close that. The 4 megabytes here happens to be the space for the beacon stage allocated by the stager. And there you can see the MZ header. This program cannot be run in DOS mode. So those are indicators of a PE file in memory. Very important. Notice it begins at the beginning of this region of allocated memory. So one does not need to do a linear search to look for that stuff. They can just look at the first few bytes of every region of allocated pages and find these offensive tools by default, depending on how the tool is written. And right here, this happens to be the beacon payload in memory itself. So that's what you're seeing. And I know that because 268 kilobytes is the size of image in the beacon reflective DLL header. So we stand out. That's the main thing I want you to take here. These read, write, execute pages all point to something offensive and potentially malicious in this case. And I've also pointed out not just these memory properties, but I've pointed out the content as well, and how the content doesn't work for us. So that's how you use Process Hacker to look at these kinds of heuristics. We've gone through some of the heuristics. Let's talk about where they're applied and how. I'm going to talk about point-in-time analysis and real-time detection and prevention. Let's start with point-in-time analysis. Point-in-time analysis is what I most often associate with a hunt assessment. Point-in-time analysis might involve a non-persistent software agent run once that walks through a snapshot of the current processes, threads, and memory, looking at their content and properties for signs of malicious activity. Sometimes the factors we just spoke about are each used in isolation to determine what to report. The information is fed back to an analyst who reviews this information and determines which actions to take. Here, it's okay to use a heuristic by itself as a filter of what to report or not, because an analyst can do cross-correlation of these reported activities on their own. So that's point-in-time analysis. I have an interest in real-time detection and prevention, what automated products do. Now, I want to caution you, don't associate the use of memory detections with a specific product category. There are antivirus products that use these techniques. There are EDR products that do so. And these things show up in different ways in different types of products. So just keep that in mind, okay? But when I think real-time detection and prevention, I think persistent software agent that is always running on the system. And I think event-driven, when a new process is created, a new thread is created, or other observable things, the product looks at the content and properties of that process, of its threads, of its memory, or the memory associated with that new thread, and looks at the heuristics I just described and tries to correlate multiple signs of malicious activity to say, hey, has the action I just observed put that process or thread over some threshold of malicious? And where that process or thread happens to fall in that program's scoring is going to determine whether or not the program does nothing, fires an alert, or denies the action altogether. In the case of software systems that do real-time detection and prevention, there is a bias against false positives. Remember that. There's no better way to get kicked out of an organization than to have your software solution go wild and corrupt business files or require a whole reimage of the enterprise. It does happen time to time. When it comes to defeating real-time detection and prevention tools, remember that it's never really one heuristic that's getting you caught. It's usually the combination of multiple heuristics and sometimes the absence of trust. I've seen from my own participation exercises situations where a program signed with a valid code signing certificate gets more leeway in terms of which heuristics it can trigger before it's quarantined than a program that is not signed. So keep that in mind. All right, I promised you a list of detection tools you could download today and play with. So here's the 4 tools and collections of rules I'm going to point you to. The first is a program called Reflection Injection Detection. Say that 3 times. This program, available on GitHub, looks for 3 items before it considers something malicious. It looks for the combination of memory, not associated with a module on disk or a memory map file, the presence of an MZ header, and RWX permissions. If you happen to break either of these 3 items, this program won't detect you. It's a good lesson in that principle I'm describing, where the combination of heuristics matters. Another favorite that I got to experience firsthand at an exercise before I learned that my own employee wrote it is Get Injected Thread by Jared Atkinson. Get Injected Thread is a PowerShell script that walks through the threads on a system and looks for any threads that have a start address not associated with a module on disk. And what Get Injected Thread will do is it will report those threads. It will report the first 100 or so bytes of the memory associated with that thread. And it will also report the permissions of that thread as well. All information that an analyst can look at and try to say, is that weird? I need to look more at it? Or what's going on here? So Get Injected Thread is definitely a good one to be aware of. And that is available as a GitHub gist on Jared Atkinson's GitHub profile. Another tool that's interesting, not so much from a detection standpoint, but from an analysis and triage point of view, is a tool called Loki from Florian Roth's company, Nextron Systems. What I use Loki for is to scan a file for Yara signature matches. Loki does have other features as well, but the ability to just take a reflective DLL as is and see which signatures it triggers against, I personally find kind of valuable. You can also see the Yara rules used by Loki and one of Nextron Systems commercial scanners, Spark, at the GitHub repository below. Nextron does have a commercial scanner called Thor, which has a proprietary rule base as well, if that kind of thing interests you. One thing, though, what I want you to think about when thinking about this triage step, and in particular content for specific tools, is some of these heuristics, like looking for threads with a start address that has certain memory permissions, or looking at threads that happen to not be associated with a module on disk, and looking for indicators of a PE file. Well, that information can lead to what an analyst needs to carve the actual DLL out of memory and start looking at its properties. So one chain of heuristics you might see is a program looking for DLLs in memory and then applying these kinds of rules to determine what the DLL is, maybe even a security product, which might get a free pass. So something to think about. Maybe you can make your DLL look like that security product. Kind of cool. Anyways, in terms of rules used to analyze DLL files and determine what they are, this is a great GitHub collection. Certainly worth your time to browse or grep through. Well then, I think that was a fun introduction to In-memory Evasion. We started out with a definition for memory detections. We talked about the observable properties of processes, threads, and memory, and specifically the anomalies in these properties that are signs of a memory-injected DLL. We talked in general about some applications of the heuristics that look for these anomalies, and I introduced you to a few detection tools. Now that concludes part 1 of In-memory Evasion. What I'd like to close with, though, are a few resources to go further from the information in this particular lecture. The first would be the excellent Art of Memory Forensics book. Chapters 6, 7, and 8 are especially relevant to the content in this course. So I highly recommend, if you don't have this book, get it, read it. It's great stuff. Another resource I'd like to direct you to is the Advanced Attack Detection presentation by 2 researchers from Countercept. This presentation walks through the Metasploit framework with these particular heuristics and a trial copy of Cobalt Strike that these researchers requested and received. The presentation, the technical content is fantastic. It is well worth your time.